Okay, I've come across a report on the definition of Islamophobia, or rather, issues around the definition of Islamophobia, which I think produces a lot of important talking points. I'm going to read out the first bit of the article, but not all of it because it's a bit long, and I want to just share some of my thoughts on this. So, it's from the BBC. The government has rejected the definition of Islamophobia created by a cross-party group of MPs. The all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims wanted to define it to tackle what are called a social evil, but a government spokesman said the wording needed further careful consideration and had not been broadly accepted. The Secretary-General of the Muslim Council of Britain, Harun Khan, called the decision truly extraordinary. MPs will debate the definition in Parliament on Thursday. It says Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. The wording has the support of a number of political parties, and this is very important, including Labour, the Liberal Democrats, and the Scottish Conservatives, and several Muslim groups. That's very important because if this goes down a slippery path, and I'll be coming to that in a minute, that needs to be remembered who supported these moves to politicise Islamism. But concerns have been raised that the definition is too vague and could undermine efforts to tackle extremism. In a letter to Prime Minister Theresa May, seen by the Times, Martin Hewitt, who chairs the National Police Chiefs Council, said it could cause confusion among officers and hamper the fight against terrorism. Former Conservative Chair Baroness Varzi, who became the first Muslim woman to attend Cabinet in 2010, said the letter was irresponsible scaremongering. She told BBC Radio 4's Today programme that a non-legally binding working definition would not affect the work of the police and urged the government to back it. That's her opinion. Um, Frankly, I don't think Baroness Varzi has much credibility because she has a long track record of being an apologist, not a supporter of, but an apologist of Islamism. What I mean by that is every time the issue of Islamic extremism has come up, she has immediately tried to deflect it into the Islamophobia narrative. I'm not impressed by her track record. Another MP, Labour's Naz Shah, has been very vocal about this, but Naz Shah, this is a woman who actually liked a tweet, which means you endorse it. She liked a tweet that was blaming teenage girls, young girls, who were victims of grooming gangs, basically blaming it on them. Absolutely disgraceful. As far as I'm concerned, Naz Shah shouldn't be in Parliament, but that's that. Okay, there's a lot of things I want to. And the irony is, she's Labour's. I just caught this. She's Labour's shadow minister for women and equalities. Women and equalities. A woman who wouldn't back young women who've been victims of grooming gangs. Pathetic. Shows you where the Labour Party is these days under Corbyn. But anyway, there are some very grave considerations around where this could go. Firstly, Islamophobia. Islamophobia. This is a term I've never liked because I feel that more often than not, it's been used as a way to shackle legitimate criticism of Islamic extremism. That is incredibly dangerous because this will be a gateway for Islamists to get their way and ultimately have blasphemy laws by stealth. It's already being attempted in Canada after the Quebec City mosque attack, which was a terrible crime. There were attempts to um, bring in, again, criticism of Islam, deflating that, or excuse me, mixing this up with anti-Muslim bigotry is a very dangerous thing. We need to understand that criticism of Islam, or any religion for that matter, but I'm particularly focusing on Islam here with good reason, is not the same as hating individual Muslims. Now, if there is a problem in Tory ranks, and I know there are some in Labour and others who say that the Tories are in denial of this, if there is a problem in Tory ranks of members or MPs who are expressing hatred against all Muslims, stirring up hatred against all Muslims, or talking about the Muslims in collective terms. That's wrong. It needs to be challenged. So I do not believe that anti-Muslim bigotry doesn't exist. It does. Yesterday, the chef Nadia Hussein was talking about horrible bullying she received as a young woman, and you could tell that it brought back painful memories for her, like really horrible racist bullying. Um, and I know that Islam isn't a race, but sometimes racists don't care. They're more likely to target brown skinned Muslims than white Muslims, so that's where it kind of crosses over. So I've no problem with tackling anti-Muslim bigotry. I've no problem with calling out those, condemning those, and in the case of elected representatives, punishing those who are pushing anti-Muslim bigotry. But there are a lot of people in establishment politics, quite frankly, who are pandering to a very dangerous narrative that criticizing Islam equates to bigotry. Shame on the Liberal Democrats. It really doesn't surprise me. I'm disappointed, but not surprised. Although I can't really say I'm disappointed because I haven't been in the party for 9 years, and that's one of the reasons I left. But they are far too weak on tackling Islamic extremism. And in recent weeks and months, they've shown that they're not just weak; they're actively appeasing Islamic extremism, which is disgusting. I mean, when they suspended the candidate simply for saying that young girls should not be coerced into wearing the hijab, that's that shows you where they lie. Anyway, defining Islamophobia or defining anti-Muslim bigotry versus the concept of Islamophobia is extremely important. I think the term itself is problematic, like I say, because Islamists use it to deflect, to try and silence criticism of Islam. Now, if you ask the Muslim Council of Britain, is that what they're trying to do? They'll deny it. But dig beneath the surface, what the Muslim Council of Britain is a polite face of political Islam. That's what they are. They will always condemn terrorism. Um, but you dig beneath the surface, they've got some very clear Islamist views. And by definition, they are Islamists. They may be moderate Islamists compared to the likes of ISIS, um, I mean, they're not terrorists, but they are political Islamists. And the way I see it, you give an Islamist an inch, they'll take a mile. We need to be very, very, very wary of any attempts to criminalize criticism of religion. Now, I know Baroness Varzi is saying this is non-legally binding, but it would just be one step to go to that extent, because you would have a situation, for example, there might be, I don't know, a mosque might face an arson attack, which would be awful, but you cannot use that as a way to have this blanket definition that criticism of a religion equates to bigotry against its adherents. A guy phoned into LBC the other day. He was an atheist and he said he was against all religions, but it's only with Islam you get smeared as a bigot. If you criticize Christianity in this country, and I would say this to atheists, it's very easy to criticize Christianity. There might be a debate about it, but you're never going to be called a racist for criticizing Christianity. Yet there's many black Christians. Yet if you criticize Islam, you're immediately accused of pandering to the far right, of being Islamophobic, a bigot, a racist. Why? There are white Muslims. And like I said earlier in the video, there are racists who will, they'll use it as an excuse to, they there is overlap in what they represent. But this is just very dangerous, and I think it should chill anyone. It should scare anyone. But Baroness Varzi calls it scaremongering. The police are entitled to be concerned about this. They're the ones on the front line, not her. They're the ones who have to, you know, do this difficult job of tackling extremism. And how can she second guess that? How can she say it's scaremongering when she doesn't have to do their job? What she should do is speak to them and try and understand their concerns rather than just dismissing it. Now, Not that she's a member of the cabinet anyway, she's a backbencher. But there's another issue here. Some people might use a whataboutery argument. What I mean by that is they'll say, oh, well, particularly Muslims might say, individual Muslims might say, well, there's been all this thing of anti Semitism in Labour, so why shouldn't there be scrutiny of Islamophobia in Tory ranks? Like I say, where there are examples of clear anti Muslim bigotry, that absolutely has to be tackled because someone in politics in a position of responsibility shouldn't be, stirring up hatred against a minority group. But if they're simply criticising Islam, that is not the same thing. So, for example, Boris Johnson's much talked about burqa comments was not an attack on all Muslims, it was an attack on a regressive, barbaric cultural practice that has no place in this country. Which basically, it's how anyone could rationally defend the burqa, I do not know. But that was not an attack on all Muslims. That was an attack on a backward practice that has no place here. So if they want to cite that as an example of Islamophobia, that is nonsense. So on the anti-Semitism issue, I feel that the anti-Semitism that's been raised is not criticism of Judaism, the religion, but it's attacks on the Jews. It's been promotion of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Now, I will put a caveat here. If, for example, we're talking about universities and so on, if there is a situation whereby people are forced to abide by any definition of anti-Semitism, which extends to saying you can't criticize Israel, I would not support that. Academics and others have a right to criticize Israel. I'll always defend that. Although I'm a supporter of Israel, although I'm broadly pro-Israel, I will defend the right to criticize Israel. And those right-wing Jews who say, who do want to extend anti-Semitism to that, they're wrong. And I will say to their face that they're wrong. But those who are pushing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish world control, etc., and to do extend their criticism of Israel to then get into the Jews or being against all Israelis for that matter, that's also a form of bigotry, saying all Israelis are the problem. That's bigotry. That's what it is. And I think sometimes my issue with criticism of Israel is that sometimes it is just legitimate criticism of Israeli politics, but more often than not, you dig beneath the surface, it does go into something else. And I also would challenge critics of Israel. Why the obsession with Israel? Why do you ignore what China is doing, particularly Muslim critics of Israel? Why do you ignore what China is doing? The biggest mass incarceration since World War II is going on in China right now. It's an abomination. What about the persecution of the Rohingya people in Burma? There are many examples of human rights abuses around the world. And if you look at the Middle East, by far the most progressive place for LGBT rights, for example, is Israel. That's why they're hosting the Eurovision. That's why, with the Eurovision on Saturday, they've had to step up security. Because think about that, it's a double insult to the Islamists. It's an event that's well known for being LGBT friendly, and it's in Israel. So that's kind of like a double target for them. But anyway, not to go too far off on a tangent, it is absolutely pivotal that we take any sort of moves to have any attempt whatsoever to bring in blasphemy law by stealth. And yes, I'm focusing on Islam because generally Christianity gets mocked all the time. I mean, think about, Vickers and Tarts parties. Do you see the church up in arms about that? Do you see demands for it to be halted? Think of the number of times Jesus has been parodied and mocked in animation and so on. Do that with the Prophet Muhammad and see what happens. So there is a difference. There is. I'm not saying there aren't Christian extremists. Of course there are. But there is a fundamental difference in the response. And that's what the guy who phoned in LBC said, and I think he was right. There is a fundamental difference in the response. Now, do I think that we will get full scale blasphemy laws in this country on par with like Pakistan? Absolutely not, because I think the majority of British people will reject it. But even if that is in one borough in London, that is one step too far. Nowhere on this island should blasphemy laws be tolerated. I do suspect that there are MPs in areas with large Muslim populations who will be pandering to what their constituents are demanding. They're in a difficult position, to be fair, because they have to listen to their constituents. But we should be very careful about any attempts to conflate criticism of religion. And I think people have a right to dislike Islam. I think they have a right to even hate Islam, as long as it does not extend to hating Muslims. You know, we have hate crime legislation in this country already. I don't see why there needs to be further legislation. And again, I know Baroness Varsi is saying that's not the case. It's only a matter of time before it would be, before there are specific laws. Like I say, this was attempted in Canada after the Quebec City mosque attack. A senator attempted that. Um, you cannot use racism or hate crimes to then shackle freedom of expression and criticizing a religion. I will always condemn anti-Muslim bigotry because I think it's wrong and I think it polarizes reformist Muslims. But when we live in a world where people are brutally beaten to death, hounded by mobs, jailed,